Before we discuss the creative modes, let's review the basic theories of exposure by using an analogy. The amount of light needed for proper exposure is like a full bucket of water. The water tap used to fill the bucket is like the aperture or opening on your lens. The length of the camera's shutter speed is similar to the amount of time you'll have to leave the water tap turned on to fill the bucket. The wider the tap is open, the more water will come through the nozzle into the bucket. This means the tap will only need to be open for a short amount of time. If the tap only has a narrow opening, on the other hand, water will only trickle into the bucket, and you'll need to leave the water turned on for a much longer period of time to fill it up. Aperture is related to shutter speed in a similar way. If the aperture is small, you'll need to have a slower shutter speed to gather enough light to create the proper exposure. If the aperture is large, however, you'll need to have a faster shutter speed to create the same effect. It's important to know that shutter speed doesn't only affect the exposure, it also affects the image's clarity when you're shooting action scenes. A fast shutter speed will freeze a moving object, and a slow shutter speed will blur a moving object. Fast shutter speeds are good for shooting subjects that move quickly, such as athletes. Slow shutter speeds are useful when you want to blur the action. This can be good if you're trying to capture the movement of water or streaks of light at night. It's also important to understand the secondary effects of aperture. A small aperture not only allows less light to reach the image sensor, but it also makes the entire scene appear sharper and more in focus. This optical phenomenon is called a long depth of field. It's especially useful when you want everything in the viewfinder to be sharp and in focus. A large aperture has the opposite effect. Only your selected subject will be in focus. This phenomenon is referred to as a short depth of field. Portrait photography uses a short depth of field extensively because it focuses attention on the subject. Let's briefly examine one more photographic concept: aperture and shutter stops. Both shutter speeds and apertures have a standard series of settings called stops. Opening the aperture by one stop will double the light that reaches the sensor. Similarly, speeding the shutter by one stop will reduce the light that reaches the sensor by half. Therefore, by opening the aperture one stop and speeding the shutter by one stop, the exposure is kept constant. By opening the aperture 2 or 3 stops and speeding the shutter 2 or 3 stops, you'll have the same effect on the exposure. It will not change. Thus, the amount of light that reaches the sensor will remain constant. Your pictures will be just as dark or light as they were before.